"I'm not raising another man's child." The millionaire blamed her and threw her out. But 3 years later, the truth broke him. "Hi, my beautiful and loyal family. Welcome to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty crown every woman with unshakable courage, quiet wisdom, and a peace that cannot be stolen. May every sleepless night turn into strength, every heartbreak rise as healing, and every hidden battle end in victory. You are the warmth that softens bitterness, the voice that steadies fear, and the grace that holds families together. May your steps be guided, your heart be guarded, and your soul overflow with light. My precious family, don't let your hope go silent. Your faith keeps this home shining. A like is a flame of support, a comment is a bond of unity. This is mission 1,000 likes for every woman who loves without limits, forgives without praise, and rises without applause. If you carry strength in your spirit, like this video. If your heart walks with faith, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by a private courier who wouldn't meet Carrie Davis's eyes as he handed it over and left without waiting for a signature. Carrie stood in the penthouse kitchen, 8 months pregnant with Howard Moore's son, staring at the medical laboratory logo embossed on the expensive paper. Her hands trembled as she turned it over, confusion flooding through her because she hadn't ordered any tests, hadn't been to any lab except her regular obstetrician. The return address was from a facility across town she'd never heard of, and the recipient name read Howard Moore, but somehow it had ended up in her hands instead. She should have put it down, should have waited for Howard to come home from work and let him open his own mail, but something in her gut twisted with warning and she found herself tearing open the seal before she could stop herself. The words on the page made no sense at first. Paternity test results. Probability of paternity 0%. The alleged father, Howard Moore, is excluded as the biological father of the tested child. Carrie read it 3 times, her brain refusing to process what her eyes were seeing, because this had to be a mistake, had to be some kind of clerical error. She'd been with no one but Howard for 3 years, had never so much as looked at another man since the night they met at a hospital fundraiser where she was working as a nurse, and he was there representing his mother's foundation. The test was impossible, couldn't be real, had to be some terrible mix-up. She was still standing there frozen when Howard's mother, Dolores, swept through the front door, using the key Howard had never taken back, despite Carrie's subtle suggestions that maybe his mother didn't need unlimited access to their home. Dolores stopped when she saw Carrie holding the paper, and something flickered across her face too quickly to identify before her expression settled into concerned sympathy that felt wrong, felt practiced, felt like a mask she'd prepared in advance. "Oh, darling, you found it," Dolores said, moving closer with the careful steps of someone approaching a wounded animal. "I'm so sorry you had to see that alone. I asked the courier to deliver it to Howard's office, but these services are so unreliable. Howard wanted to handle this privately, didn't want to upset you unnecessarily, but now that you know the truth, perhaps it's better this way. Clean breaks are kindest in situations like these." Carrie's voice came out strangled, barely recognizable as her own. "This can't be right. I've never been with anyone else. There's been no one but Howard since the day we met. This test is fake or mixed up or something because I know this baby is his." Dolores's expression shifted into something that looked like pity but felt like satisfaction, and she pulled out her phone to show Carrie a series of photos. Images of Carrie at the gym with a man Carrie vaguely recognized as someone who worked at the front desk. Photos taken at angles that made innocent conversations look intimate, timestamps and dates that Carrie remembered completely differently. The man's name was Derek, and he'd helped her once when her locker jammed. Had chatted with her a few times about prenatal exercise routines because his sister was also pregnant. Interactions that lasted maybe 5 minutes total, but looked damning in still images stripped of context. "Howard has been investigating for weeks," Dolores continued, her voice gentle in a way that made Carrie's skin crawl. "He didn't want to believe it either, but the evidence kept mounting. The late nights you claimed to be at prenatal classes when you were actually at the gym. The way you started dressing nicer, wearing makeup to supposedly run errands. Howard hired a private investigator before ordering the paternity test, and I'm afraid what they found confirmed his worst fears. This Derek person has quite a history with vulnerable women, and you wouldn't be the first he's seduced with promises of a better life. The lies were so smooth, so perfectly constructed, that for a moment Carrie felt reality tilt beneath her feet. She knew none of this was true, knew she'd been at prenatal classes every time she said she was, knew Derek was just a friendly gym employee who'd never said anything remotely inappropriate. But Dolores was presenting an alternative version of events, with such confidence, with photographs and timelines and a paternity test from a real medical laboratory, that Carrie felt her certainty waver despite knowing the truth in her bones. "I want to talk to Howard," Carrie said, forcing strength into her voice that she didn't feel. "I want to hear this from him. He knows me. He knows I would never do this. We're getting married next month. We've been planning our life together. He wouldn't believe this without talking to me first." Dolores's smile was sad and pitying. "He's in meetings all day, but he'll be home by 6. He asked me to be here when you found out, to make sure you didn't do anything rash. He's prepared to be generous with the settlement despite everything. He'll make sure you have enough money for the child's care, even though legally he has no obligation once paternity is disproved. Howard may be hurt, but he's not cruel. He understands that you must have been desperate to trap a wealthy man, that women like you are driven by circumstances beyond their control." The phrase "women like you" hung in the air with all its ugly implications, and Carrie finally understood. This was Dolores's doing, had been planned and executed with precision, fabricated evidence and falsified tests deployed to destroy the relationship Dolores had despised from the beginning. Howard's mother had never hidden her disapproval of Carrie, had made comments about her modest background and nursing career, had suggested repeatedly that Howard deserved someone from their social circle, someone who understood their world. But Carrie never imagined Dolores would go this far, would construct an entire false narrative backed by manufactured proof. "You did this," Carrie said, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "You fabricated all of this because you don't want me in Howard's life. That test is fake. Those photos are taken out of context. This whole story about Derek is a lie you created, and when Howard gets home, I'm going to tell him exactly what you've done. And he's going to believe me because he loves me and knows I would never betray him." Dolores's mask slipped for just a moment, and Carrie saw cold calculation underneath the sympathetic exterior. "You can tell Howard whatever you like, but the evidence speaks for itself. A paternity test from a reputable laboratory, photographs documenting your affair, testimony from multiple sources about your suspicious behavior. Even if Howard wants to believe you, even if love makes him foolish, the facts are undeniable, and I'll be here to help him see reason when his emotions cloud his judgment." The front door opened and Howard walked in, home hours earlier than expected, and Carrie's heart leapt with relief that died the moment she saw his face. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, cold and closed off, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. He looked at her like she was a stranger, like the 3 years they'd spent building a life together had been erased in the hours since morning when he'd kissed her goodbye and told her he loved her. "Howard, please listen to me," Carrie started, but he held up one hand to stop her, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "I don't want to hear excuses or explanations or whatever story you've prepared. The test is conclusive, Carrie. 0% probability means exactly what it sounds like. That baby isn't mine, and I'm not going to raise another man's child while you laugh about how you tricked the rich fool into playing father." The cruelty in his voice shocked Carrie more than the words themselves, because this wasn't the Howard she knew, wasn't the gentle man who cried during emotional movies and brought her flowers for no reason and talked to her belly every night telling their son how loved he would be. This was someone his mother had shaped, someone who believed DNA results over 3 years of loyalty, someone who could look at her 8 months pregnant and see a con artist instead of his partner. "I have never touched another man since the night we met," Carrie said, her voice breaking. I don't know how she faked that test or who she paid off at whatever laboratory she used, but I swear on everything I am that this baby is yours. Derek from the gym is someone I've spoken to maybe 5 times total, never about anything except exercise and his pregnant sister. Your mother is lying to you, manipulating you the same way she's controlled you your entire life, and you're letting her destroy us because you're too afraid to stand up to her. Howard flinched at that last part, and Carrie saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been doubt. But then Dolores moved closer to her son and put her hand on his arm, and whatever moment of uncertainty existed vanished under his mother's touch. "I've arranged for movers to pack your things tomorrow," Howard said, his voice flat and final. "You have until then to leave. I'll provide financial support for the child despite the circumstances, because whatever you've done, the baby is innocent. But I never want to see you again, Carrie. I never want to hear from you. You've destroyed something I thought was real, and I can't forgive that." Carrie looked between Howard and Dolores and understood that she'd lost before the fight even began, that Dolores had constructed her trap too carefully, and Howard was too weak to question the mother who'd shaped his entire worldview. She could beg, could plead, could scream the truth until her voice gave out, but nothing would penetrate the wall Dolores had built between them. So Carrie made a choice born of pride and survival instinct, decided that if Howard believed the worst of her this easily, then he didn't deserve the truth. "I'll be gone by morning," Carrie said, her voice suddenly calm in a way that surprised her. "But 3 years from now, 5 years, 10 years from now, when you finally figure out what she did to you, don't come looking for me. Don't come looking for your son, because I'm done fighting for someone who won't fight for me." She walked past them both toward the bedroom to pack, and as she left, she heard Dolores whisper something to Howard that she couldn't quite make out, but she caught the satisfied tone underneath the sympathetic words and knew that Dolores had won exactly what she wanted. Carrie Davis packed her life into 3 suitcases while 8 months pregnant, and when she walked out of Howard Moore's penthouse at dawn, she carried not just her belongings, but a determination that neither of them would ever find her again, that she would disappear so completely that when the truth finally emerged, it would be far too late for Howard to fix what his cowardice had destroyed. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. The bus terminal at dawn was a monument to broken dreams and desperate new beginnings, and Carrie Davis sat on a plastic chair with her 3 suitcases and $847 in cash, trying to decide which direction to run. She'd withdrawn everything from her personal account before Howard could freeze it, maxed out her single credit card, buying a prepaid phone and first aid supplies, and now she was choosing between bus tickets to cities she'd never visited based entirely on which one left soonest. Her back ached with the particular intensity that meant labor might be coming soon, but she couldn't think about that yet, couldn't afford the hospital bills or the attention that checking into a maternity ward would bring. She needed distance first, needed to disappear into a place where Howard's money and investigators couldn't reach. Then she could worry about safely delivering the baby she was carrying alone. The clerk at the ticket window was a tired woman with kind eyes who looked at Carrie's pregnant belly and didn't ask questions she probably wanted to ask. "Where to, honey?" Carrie's eyes scanned the departure board and landed on a city name that meant nothing to her. No connections or memories, just random enough to be perfect. "Springfield. Next bus available." "That's in 4 hours. You got somewhere to wait where you'll be comfortable? I don't like seeing women in your condition sitting on these hard chairs." The unexpected kindness nearly broke Carrie's composure, but she held it together and nodded. "I'll be fine. Just need to get somewhere new, start over fresh." The woman printed the ticket and then did something that probably violated company policy. She scribbled an address on a slip of paper and pushed it across the counter. "My sister runs a women's shelter in Springfield. You show up there and tell her Pauline sent you. She'll make sure you have a place to stay until you get on your feet. No judgment, no questions you don't want to answer." Carrie took the paper with shaking hands, and this time the tears did come, unstoppable and messy. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." "I got some idea," Pauline said gently. "I've been where you are, Different circumstances, but same desperate feeling. You're going to be okay, honey. You and that baby are going to make it through whatever brought you here. The 4-hour wait felt endless. Carrie bought terrible coffee and stale donuts from a vending machine, tried to eat because the baby needed nutrition even if her stomach was twisted with anxiety, and watched the terminal fill with travelers, whose problems all seemed smaller than hers, young couples heading to romantic weekends, business people focused on laptops and phone calls, families with excited children pointing at the buses, normal people living normal lives while Carrie's entire world had collapsed in less than 24 hours. Her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize, and her heart stopped until she opened it and saw it was just a spam message about car insurance. She'd been half expecting Howard to reach out with apologies, to say he'd made a mistake and realized Dolores was lying, but there was nothing. The silence felt louder than anger would have, confirmation that he'd truly believed the worst of her and moved on without a second thought. She blocked his number and deleted it from her contacts, erasing the last easy way for him to find her, even if he eventually tried. The bus ride to Springfield took 8 hours, with multiple stops in towns that looked increasingly desperate, dollar stores and closed factories, and people whose eyes held the same exhaustion Carrie felt in her bones. She sat in the back and watched America scroll past the window, this country she'd lived in her whole life, suddenly feeling foreign and hostile. She'd been so focused on building a life with Howard that she'd neglected her own foundation, had let her nursing license lapse while playing housewife, had lost touch with friends who couldn't relate to her new, wealthy lifestyle. She had no one to call, nowhere to go, except a shelter run by a stranger's sister based on the kindness of a bus terminal clerk. The cramping started somewhere around hour 5, subtle enough to ignore at first, but growing steadily more insistent. Carrie pressed her hand to her belly and whispered to the baby that he needed to hold on just a little longer, that they were almost somewhere safe, that she would get him into the world healthy and whole if it was the last thing she did. The woman in the seat across the aisle noticed her distress and offered bottled water and granola bars, asked if she needed medical attention. Carrie refused help because accepting it meant explaining, and explaining meant staying put, and staying put meant being found. Springfield bus terminal looked exactly like every other terminal she'd seen that day, same plastic chairs and vending machines and tired travelers. Carrie climbed off the bus, moving carefully, her body screaming at her that labor was imminent, that she'd pushed too far and waited too long. She flagged a taxi with her last burst of energy and gave the driver the shelter address Pauline had written down, praying that the offer was real and not just kind words meant to comfort someone passing through. The shelter was a converted church on the edge of downtown, its stained glass windows glowing warm against the evening darkness. Carrie paid the taxi with precious cash and stood on the sidewalk trying to gather courage to walk through the door and admit she needed help. The cramps were coming every few minutes now, unmistakable contractions that meant Tiger was done waiting, that her son had decided tonight was his birthday, regardless of his mother's lack of preparation. She made it up the steps and through the front door before her water broke, fluid gushing down her legs onto the worn carpet. And she heard herself make a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, because of course this was happening now, of course her body was betraying her one last time. A woman appeared immediately, young and efficient, calling for someone named Sandra, and then there were multiple hands helping Carrie into a chair, someone pressing a phone into her hand to call an ambulance. "No ambulance," Carrie managed through gritted teeth. "No hospital. They'll ask questions, file reports. I can't leave a paper trail. Please, isn't there a midwife or someone who can help here?" Sandra turned out to be Pauline's sister, and she had the same kind eyes and same tendency toward bending rules when circumstances demanded it. "Honey, home birth is one thing, but you just got off a bus looking half dead. You need proper medical care." "I'm a nurse," Carrie said, which was technically still true even if her license had lapsed. "I know the risks. But the father, his family, they have resources to find me if I leave any official record. I can't let them take my baby. Please, I'm begging you. Help me do this off the books." Something in Sandra's expression shifted to recognition of a story she'd heard too many times. Wealthy men trying to steal children from mothers they deemed unfit, legal systems that favored money over justice. "We have a midwife who volunteers here twice a week. I can call her, see if she'll come emergency, but no promises. You need to understand you're risking both your lives." "I understand," Carrie said. And then another contraction hit, and understanding became irrelevant under the wave of pain that whited out her vision. The next 6 hours existed in fragments, pieced together through gaps in memory that trauma or exhaustion created. The midwife arriving with equipment and competent hands, Sandra holding Carrie's hand through contractions that felt like they were tearing her apart, voices encouraging her to push when pushing felt impossible. The moment Tiger emerged screaming and angry into the world, his cry the most beautiful sound Carrie had ever heard. The midwife saying something was wrong, too much bleeding, Carrie's body not responding the way it should, decisions being made around her while darkness pulled at the edges of her consciousness. She woke up 2 days later in a bed at the shelter, Tiger sleeping in a bassinet beside her, and Sandra explaining gently that she'd almost died, that the midwife and a doctor who worked with the shelter had spent hours trying to stop the hemorrhaging, that it was touch and go for a while, whether either of them would make it. Carrie should rest now, should focus on recovery and bonding with her son, and when she was strong enough, they'd talk about next steps and long-term plans and how to build a life from this new beginning. Carrie looked at Tiger, this perfect tiny person who had no idea how close he'd come to losing his mother before ever knowing her, and made a promise whispered into the quiet room. She would keep him safe from Howard's mother's manipulations, would raise him knowing his own worth regardless of his father's rejection, would build a life so far removed from that penthouse that the past became just a story she told herself sometimes to remember how strong she'd become. She would disappear completely, and when Howard Moore finally learned the truth about his son, it would be far too late to matter. Chapter 3. 3 years of silence. Tiger's 3rd birthday party was a small affair in the backyard of their apartment complex, 6 children from his preschool and their mothers, dollar store decorations, and a grocery store cake that said, "Happy Birthday" in blue frosting. Nothing like the elaborate celebrations Carrie once imagined back when she thought Howard would be there to help blow out candles. Carrie watched her son run through the sprinkler with his friends, screaming with joy, his skin golden in the late afternoon sun, and his laugh so pure it hurt her chest. 3 years had transformed them both in ways she never anticipated. Tiger was confident and bright and funny, showed no signs of missing the father he'd never known. Carrie was stronger, harder around the edges maybe, but capable in ways she'd never accessed when someone else was paying the bills and making decisions. She'd rebuilt her nursing career, working night shifts at a hospital an hour away, far enough from Springfield proper that she felt safe from accidental discovery, close enough that the commute didn't steal all her time with Tiger. They lived small but comfortable. A 2-bedroom apartment in a complex that catered to single mothers and young families, neighbors who watched each other's kids and shared groceries when money was tight. Carrie had friends now, real ones who knew her as just Carrie, the night shift nurse, not as Howard Moore's pregnant girlfriend living in a penthouse. She'd built this life carefully, deliberately, choosing simplicity over ambition, because keeping Tiger safe mattered more than career advancement or comfortable living. The fear that Howard might find them had faded over 3 years into background noise, ever present but no longer paralyzing. Tiger blew out his candles and made a wish he wouldn't tell anyone, and Carrie felt her phone buzz in her pocket with a notification she'd been dreading. Her nursing license renewal application had been flagged for review, some bureaucratic complication that required her to appear in person at the state licensing board office with documentation proving her identity and work history. She'd used her maiden name and carefully constructed a paper trail that showed no connection to Howard, but any official scrutiny made her nervous. Any attention drawn to her existence felt like tempting fate. "Everything okay?" asked Janet, one of the mothers from Tiger's preschool, who'd become Carrie's closest friend over the past year. She was a paralegal who'd divorced her husband after discovering his gambling addiction, raising her daughter alone while working full-time and somehow maintaining optimism about humanity's better nature. Just work stuff, nothing important, Carrie lied, because she'd never told anyone the full story about Tiger's father, had let people assume she was a widow or amicably divorced, anything other than the complicated truth about a billionaire who threw her out pregnant and a future mother-in-law who fabricated evidence to destroy their relationship. Janet didn't push, which was one of the things Carrie appreciated about their friendship. Everyone at the complex had stories they didn't fully share, traumas, and failures, and complicated pasts that led them to this place where rent was affordable and nobody judged. They'd formed a community based on mutual respect for privacy and shared understanding of survival, and it worked better than any social circle Carrie had navigated in her previous life. That night, after Tiger fell asleep, exhausted from cake and sprinklers and the overwhelming joy of being 3 years old, Carrie sat on her tiny balcony and let herself think about Howard for the first time in months. She wondered if he ever thought about her, if he'd married someone his mother approved of, if he'd had other children who bore his name and inheritance. She wondered if he'd discovered the truth about Dolores's manipulation or if he still believed Carrie had betrayed him. The wondering felt less painful now than it had in the beginning, more like examining an old scar than pressing on an open wound. Her phone rang with an unknown number, and Carrie's heart jumped before she could remind herself that wrong numbers existed, that not every unexpected call was a threat. She let it go to voicemail and then listened to the message left by a woman with a professional voice asking Carrie to call back regarding an urgent matter concerning Howard Moore's estate. Carrie's blood turned cold. Estate meant death or incapacity, meant something catastrophic had happened, and despite everything she felt her chest constrict with an emotion she didn't want to examine too closely. She called back before she could talk herself out of it, and the woman who answered identified herself as Rebecca Flynn, attorney for Howard Moore. "Ms. Davis, I've been trying to locate you for several months. I represent Mr. Moore in a legal matter that requires your testimony. I understand the relationship between you ended badly, but the situation has changed significantly, and I believe you'll want to hear what I have to say." "Is Howard hurt? What happened?" Carrie heard herself ask, hating that she still cared, that 3 years of silence hadn't killed whatever connection had once bound them together. "Mr. Moore is alive, but facing serious legal complications following his mother's death 8 months ago. During the investigation of Dolores Moore's estate, certain documents came to light suggesting financial fraud and other criminal activities. One of those activities appears to be the falsification of a paternity test approximately 3 years ago. Mr. Moore would like the opportunity to speak with you about obtaining a legitimate paternity test for your son, if the child is indeed his, as you claimed." The words hit Carrie like physical blows. Dolores was dead. Howard knew the test was fake. He wanted to meet Tiger. The 3 years of careful separation and deliberate invisibility were about to shatter, and Carrie had approximately 30 seconds to decide whether to hang up and disappear again or engage with the legal system and risk losing control of the narrative she'd built. "I need to think about this," Carrie said finally. "I need time to consider what's best for my son, because that's all that matters now. Howard gave up his rights when he threw me out pregnant, and I'm not sure he gets to reclaim them just because he finally figured out his mother was a liar." Rebecca's voice softened with something that sounded like understanding. "I appreciate your position, Ms. Davis, and I'm not here to pressure you, but I should mention that Mr. Moore has been searching for you for months ever since the truth came out. He's hired multiple investigators and exhausted significant resources trying to locate you and your son. If you don't engage willingly, he will eventually find you anyway, and the reunion will happen on his terms rather than yours. Might be better to have some control over how this unfolds." The implicit threat was clear, even wrapped in gentle language. Run again, and Howard would chase her with all the money and determination he'd failed to show 3 years ago when it mattered. Stay, and at least she could set boundaries, could control how and when Tiger met the father who'd rejected him before birth. Neither option felt like winning, but one felt marginally less like losing. I'll agree to a paternity test, Carrie said, hating every word, but the results stay private until I decide what to do with them. If the test confirms Howard is Tiger's father, then we'll discuss next steps, but I'm not promising anything beyond that. And Howard doesn't get my address or any way to contact me directly until I'm ready. Everything goes through you. Rebecca agreed to the terms, and they scheduled an appointment for the following week with a legitimate testing facility that would ensure chain of custody and legal validity. Carrie hung up and sat in the darkness of her balcony, watching the stars and trying to process that the past she'd buried was about to dig itself up and demand attention. She thought about waking Tiger, holding him close, preparing him somehow for the father who was coming whether they wanted him or not. But he was 3 years old and sleeping peacefully, dreaming whatever 3-year-olds dream, and she couldn't bring herself to disturb that innocence before she absolutely had to. The next morning, Carrie called Sandra at the shelter and told her everything, all the details she'd kept private for 3 years, and Sandra listened without judgment before offering advice, born from seeing hundreds of women navigate complicated situations with men who hurt them. "You give him nothing he hasn't earned," Sandra said firmly. "That man threw you out pregnant and nearly killed you both through his cowardice. The fact that he eventually figured out his mother was lying doesn't erase what he did. You let him prove he's changed, prove he's worth knowing his son, and you don't feel 1 ounce of guilt about making him work for it. Your job is protecting Tiger, not managing Howard's feelings about being a father 3 years too late." The words settled something in Carrie's chest, gave her permission to be angry when forgiveness felt premature, reminded her that survival wasn't the same as healing, and she owed Howard nothing just because he'd finally learned the truth. She would do the paternity test because legally he could probably force it eventually anyway, but after that, every single interaction would be on her terms, at her pace, with Tiger's well-being as the only factor that mattered. Howard Moore would have to earn his way back into their lives, one painful step at a time, and if he couldn't handle that, he could return to his wealthy, isolated existence and leave them alone. 3 years of silence were about to end, and Carrie steeled herself for the confrontation she'd avoided for so long, knowing that this time she was strong enough to face him without breaking. Chapter 4. The Truth Surfaces. Howard Moore sat across from his mother in her pristine living room, the paternity test report between them, and watched Dolores's face carefully as he asked the question that would define everything. "Did you fake this test?" 6 months had passed since Carrie left. Howard had tried to move on, dated women his mother approved of, buried himself in work, but something kept nagging at him. The way Carrie had looked at him that last day, not with guilt, but with genuine confusion and betrayal. The gym employee Derek, who'd moved across the country 2 weeks after the confrontation, unreachable for follow-up questions. Small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but together formed a pattern his mother had trained him not to see. Dolores's composure slipped for just a second before she recovered. "Howard, we've been through this. That woman manipulated you and I proved it. Why are you revisiting ancient history?" "Because I hired my own investigator," Howard said, his voice steady despite the fury building in his chest. "The laboratory that processed this test had its license revoked for falsifying results in custody cases. The doctor who signed off doesn't exist in any medical database. And the woman you paid to photograph Carrie with Derek, she kept copies of your payment records, and she's willing to testify if I pursue legal action." Dolores stood and walked to the window, her back rigid. When she spoke, her voice carried an emotion Howard had never heard from her before, something that sounded almost like fear. "You don't understand what you're asking me to admit. Then help me understand," Howard said. "Because from where I'm sitting, you destroyed my family with lies, cost me 3 years with my son, and nearly killed the woman I loved. And I need to know why, Mother. I need to understand what could possibly justify what you did." The silence stretched until Dolores turned back, and Howard saw something in her face he'd never seen. Vulnerability mixed with defiance, a crack in the iron facade she'd maintained his entire life. Your father left me for a woman like her, young, beautiful, from nothing, and I was supposed to just accept it because he said she made him happy. He walked away from our marriage, from you, from everything we'd built, because she made him feel free the way I supposedly never could. Howard felt the ground shift beneath him. Dad didn't die in a car accident. He died in her apartment of a heart attack, in her bed, while I was at home raising his son alone. Dolores's voice was cold, but underneath Howard heard decades of pain she'd never acknowledged. And you were falling in love with someone exactly like her, someone who would take you from me the same way, someone who would make you choose between your heritage and whatever fantasy she sold you. I couldn't watch it happen again. So you destroyed us, Howard said quietly. You fabricated evidence and manipulated me into throwing out the mother of my child because you couldn't deal with your own trauma from Dad's affair. You made me into the abandoner because you couldn't save your own marriage. I was protecting you. Dolores's composure finally shattered. She would have left you eventually, taken half your money, raised your son to resent everything about who you are. I saved you from that humiliation, that pain. I saved you from becoming what your father became, a man who threw away everything real for something that felt good temporarily. Howard stood, and the man who faced his mother was different from the obedient son who'd believed her lies. Carrie never wanted my money. She turned down a joint account, kept working, built her own life. She loved me, not my wealth or status. And you couldn't stand it because it proved Dad's affair wasn't about class or money. It was about you, about how controlling and manipulative you were then, and how you still are now. Don't you dare. I'm not finished. Howard's voice cut through her protest. You owe me 3 years with my son. You owe Carrie an apology for nearly killing her when you threw her out pregnant. And you owe yourself the truth that your husband didn't leave because his mistress was poor. He left because you made it impossible to breathe in this family. Dolores's face went white, then red. If you pursue this, if you go back to that woman, I will cut you off completely. The trust funds, the company shares, everything I control. You'll have nothing. Then I'll have nothing, Howard said, and felt lighter than he had in years. Because the alternative is having you, and that's worse than poverty. He walked out of his mother's house and never went back. The lawyers handled everything after that, disentangling his assets from her control, securing his inheritance from his father that Dolores had been using as leverage, documenting her fraud for potential legal action. Dolores fought him at every step, tried manipulation and guilt, and finally threats that Howard ignored with newfound clarity. But Howard didn't immediately run to Carrie. Instead, he spent 6 months in intensive therapy, working through the childhood conditioning that made him so easy to manipulate, understanding his own role in what happened. Yes, his mother lied, but Howard had chosen to believe her lies because questioning them was harder than destroying Carrie. He had to own that choice before he had any right to ask for forgiveness. He hired investigators who found Carrie in Springfield, sent photos that confirmed Tiger was his son. His therapist asked what he wanted from reconnection, and Howard had to admit he didn't know. Forgiveness felt impossible to expect. A relationship with Tiger felt like a gift he didn't deserve. Carrie's friendship seemed like fantasy. What if the best thing I can do is support them financially without disrupting their lives? Howard asked his therapist. Is that what you want, or what you think you deserve? Howard thought about Tiger, about 3 years of moments he'd missed and would never get back. I want to know my son, but I won't force it if Carrie says no. I destroyed her trust, and she owes me nothing. The approach through Rebecca was careful, respectful, offering a paternity test as starting point rather than demanding access. When Carrie agreed to meet, Howard felt hope and terror in equal measure. His mother called the night before the test, drunk and bitter. You're throwing away your legacy for a woman who trapped you with a pregnancy and a bastard who'll never be worthy of the Moore name. Tiger is my son, Howard said calmly, and Carrie is the woman I destroyed because I was too weak to stand up to you. You did this, Mother. You created this situation with your lies, and now you get to live with the consequences of losing your son completely. You'll regret this when she takes everything from you. The only thing I regret is not standing up to you 3 years ago when it mattered." Howard hung up and blocked her number. Dolores Moore would live another year after that conversation, isolated by her own choices, attended only by paid staff. She'd reach out periodically through lawyers, trying to restore control, but Howard never responded. When she died of a stroke, Howard felt relief and grief and anger all tangled together, mourning the mother she could have been while acknowledging the damage she'd actually done. But the discovery of the trust fund with its poisonous conditions would come later. First, Howard had to face Carrie and begin the impossible work of earning back what his cowardice and his mother's cruelty had destroyed. Tomorrow he would meet his son and beg forgiveness from the woman he'd failed, knowing he might hear no forever and having to accept it as exactly what he'd earned. Chapter 5. The Testing Facility. The medical facility was aggressively neutral. Beige walls and commercial carpet and generic landscape paintings meant to soothe nervous patients, and Carrie Davis sat in the waiting room, holding Tiger's hand while trying to keep her breathing steady. Tiger was confused about why they were here, kept asking questions Carrie couldn't answer without explanations too complicated for a 3-year-old. She'd told him they were visiting a doctor for a special checkup, which was technically true, but left out the part where the checkup would prove his paternity to a father who'd rejected him before birth. Tiger accepted this explanation with the easy trust of young children, more interested in the aquarium in the corner than the legal implications of DNA testing. Rebecca Flynn sat beside them, providing moral support that Carrie both appreciated and resented, because having Howard's attorney present felt like having enemy surveillance, even though Rebecca had been nothing but professional and kind. They were waiting for Howard to arrive, and every time the door opened, Carrie's heart jumped before she could stop the reaction. She'd spent 3 years not thinking about him, building a life so complete that his absence became unremarkable, and now she couldn't stop her body from remembering that once upon a time she'd loved him completely. The door opened again, and this time it was him, and Carrie felt 3 years of careful emotional control threaten to collapse. Howard looked terrible in ways that expensive clothes couldn't hide, thinner and older and carrying exhaustion in his posture that suggested he hadn't slept properly in months. His eyes went immediately to Tiger, and Carrie watched his face transform as he saw their son for the first time, grief and wonder and love all tangled together into an expression so raw it hurt to witness. Tiger looked up from the aquarium and studied Howard with the frank curiosity children direct at strangers, no recognition or connection, just neutral assessment of a new person in his space. "Who's that, Mama?" Carrie's voice came out steadier than she felt. "That's Howard. He's the reason we're here today for the special checkup." She couldn't bring herself to say father, couldn't give Howard that title before he'd earned it, before the test proved what she already knew in her bones. Howard took a step toward them and then stopped himself, seeming to realize that approaching too quickly would frighten Tiger and anger Carrie. "Hi, Tiger. It's really nice to meet you. You're even more wonderful than I imagined." "I'm 3, Tiger announced, holding up 3 fingers. "I had a birthday party with cake and sprinklers, and my friend Jacob threw up from too much frosting." The mundane details seemed to break something in Howard, and Carrie saw tears spill down his face before he could stop them. He was crying in front of their son, who didn't understand why this stranger was emotional, and Carrie felt anger flash through her protective instincts. She stood up and positioned herself between Howard and Tiger, her voice low and sharp. "You need to compose yourself. You don't get to fall apart in front of him when you've never been part of his life. Whatever you're feeling is your problem to manage, not his burden to witness." Howard wiped his face roughly and nodded, taking a visible breath to steady himself. "You're right. I'm sorry. Seeing him, knowing what I missed, it's overwhelming. But that's not his responsibility. I'll do better." The technician called them back before Carrie could respond, and they followed her into a sterile exam room where the paternity test would be conducted. The process was simple, just cheek swabs from Howard and Tiger, but the implications were massive and irreversible. Once the test confirmed Howard's paternity, Carrie would lose the legal protection of ambiguity, would have to navigate custody and visitation, and all the complications of co-parenting with a man who'd proven he couldn't be trusted with her heart. Tiger was fascinated by the swab process, thought it was funny when the technician rubbed the inside of his cheek, told them solemnly that he didn't taste anything weird. The innocence of it gutted Carrie. This child who had no idea his entire world was about to change, who trusted that his mother would keep him safe without understanding that sometimes safety meant compromise. When the technician finished, Tiger went back to watching the aquarium while the adults handled paperwork and logistics, and Carrie was grateful he was too young to sense the tension crackling between her and Howard. Rebecca excused herself to make phone calls, leaving Carrie and Howard alone in the waiting room with Tiger as a buffer between them. The silence stretched uncomfortable until Howard broke it with a voice that shook despite obvious effort to stay controlled. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry, Carrie. I'm sorry for believing my mother over you, for throwing you out pregnant for every cruel word and moment. I'm sorry for being too weak to question anything she told me, too controlled to trust my own judgment about who you were. I'm sorry I missed 3 years of Tiger's life and all the ways you suffered raising him alone. I'm sorry for all of it, and I know sorry isn't remotely enough, but it's all I have." Carrie looked at him and felt nothing, a vast emptiness where anger used to live, and that scared her more than the anger ever had, because anger was at least an emotion connecting them. "You're right, sorry isn't enough. Sorry doesn't cover the emergency surgery, or the months I lived in a shelter, or the nights I cried so hard I couldn't breathe because you'd abandoned us. Sorry doesn't give Tiger back the father he should have had for 3 years, or give me back the partner I thought I had. Your apology is noted, Howard, but it doesn't change anything." "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Howard said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything except a chance to be Tiger's father, whatever that looks like, however limited you need it to be. I'll take supervised visits once a month if that's all you'll allow. I'll pay child support retroactively and anything else you need. I just want to know my son, Carrie. I want to be part of his life, even if I can never be part of yours again." The plea in his voice should have moved her, but Carrie felt only calculation, weighing risks and benefits like a business transaction rather than an emotional reconciliation. Tiger deserved to know his father if Howard was genuinely committed, but Carrie needed proof beyond words, needed Howard to demonstrate through sustained action that he wouldn't abandon their son the way he'd abandoned her. Trust wasn't something she could offer based on apologies. It had to be earned through months or years of consistency that Howard hadn't yet proven he possessed. "We'll see what the test says," Carrie said, her voice neutral and businesslike. "If it confirms you're Tiger's father, we'll discuss limited supervised visitation on a trial basis. But you don't get to just walk into his life and play dad when it's convenient. You show up consistently, you follow every boundary I set, you prove over time that you're worth knowing. And if you disappoint him even once, if you make promises you don't keep or hurt him the way you hurt me, I will cut you out of our lives so completely you'll never find us again. Do you understand?" "I understand," Howard said immediately. "I'll do whatever you need. I won't let you down again." Carrie wanted to believe him, but 3 years had taught her that wanting something didn't make it true, that Howard's promises were only as good as his ability to stand up to pressure, and his history suggested that ability was limited. They would start small, she decided, supervised visits in public places where Tiger would feel safe, and Carrie could maintain control. If Howard proved himself over months, they could expand access gradually. But she wouldn't risk her son's emotional well-being on a man who'd already proven he could walk away when his mother told him to. The test results would take a week to process, and Carrie left the facility with Tiger chattering about the fish in the aquarium, completely unaware that his life had just shifted on its axis. She drove home thinking about how to explain Howard to a 3-year-old. What words you use to describe a father who wasn't there for the first 3 years, but wants to be there now. The conversation would have to happen soon, before Howard's presence became a regular occurrence, and Carrie dreaded it in ways that felt overwhelming. That night, after Tiger fell asleep, Carrie called Sandra and told her about the testing facility encounter, and Sandra asked the question Carrie had been avoiding. How did you feel seeing him? Was there anything left of what you felt before, or is it really over? Carrie considered lying, but Sandra had earned honesty over 3 years of support and wisdom. I don't know. Part of me wanted to scream at him for everything he did. Part of me wanted to see if he'd grovel properly. Part of me just felt tired of carrying all this around. I'm not in love with him anymore, I know that much. But I'm not sure I hate him either, and that bothers me because hate would be cleaner than whatever this complicated mess is. You don't have to figure out your feelings right now, Sandra said gently. You just have to protect Tiger and set boundaries and let Howard prove whether he's worth trusting. Your feelings can stay complicated and confused for as long as they need to be. You've earned the right to not have this all figured out. The permission to be uncertain settled something in Carrie's chest, and she thanked Sandra before hanging up and going to stand in Tiger's doorway, watching him sleep and wondering what the future held for all of them now that the past had forced its way back into their present. Chapter 6. First Visitation. The park was neutral territory, a public space with enough people around that Carrie felt safe supervising Howard's first real interaction with Tiger, and they met on a Saturday morning when the playground was full of families enjoying the sunshine. 2 weeks had passed since the paternity test, which had confirmed what Carrie already knew with 99.9% certainty that Howard Moore was Tiger's biological father. Howard had cried when Rebecca called with the results, had apparently been incoherent with relief and grief for an hour before pulling himself together enough to ask what came next. Carrie had laid out her terms through Rebecca, supervised visitation twice a month for 3 months, then they'd reassess based on Howard's consistency and Tiger's comfort level. Howard had agreed to everything without negotiation, which should have reassured Carrie, but instead made her suspicious that he'd agree to anything in the moment and show his true character later when the novelty wore off. Tiger was excited about visiting a new park, had no idea this playdate was different from any other, didn't understand that the man who'd be meeting them was his father, rather than just another adult in his orbit. Carrie had tried to explain the night before, but her words tangled on themselves, and she'd ended up just saying Howard was someone special who wanted to meet him, which was technically accurate if woefully incomplete. The full conversation would have to happen eventually, but Carrie was delaying as long as possible, letting Tiger and Howard build some foundation before adding the weight of paternal relationship to their interaction. Howard arrived exactly on time, which Carrie noted as point in his favor because punctuality mattered when a child was involved, when a 3-year-old's concept of time made every minute feel eternal. He'd brought nothing, despite probably wanting to show up with expensive toys, had apparently learned from Rebecca's coaching that gifts were manipulation rather than connection. He wore jeans and a casual shirt that looked awkward on him, as if his body didn't quite remember how to exist in non-business attire, and he approached them with careful slowness that suggested he'd been coached on not overwhelming Tiger. "Hi, Tiger. Do you remember me from the doctor's office?" Howard asked, crouching down to Tiger's level with visible effort to make himself non-threatening. Tiger studied him seriously. "You're the crying man. Mama said you weren't sick, just having feelings." Howard flinched, but recovered quickly. "That's right. I was having big feelings because meeting you was really important to me. But today I'm not crying, see? Today I just want to play and have fun with you, if that sounds good." Tiger considered this proposal with the gravity of someone making a major decision, then nodded. "Okay, but I get to pick what we play first because Mama says the birthday person gets to choose, and I just had a birthday, so the rules still count." "That sounds completely fair," Howard agreed, and Carrie saw a genuine smile break across his face for the first time, watching their son negotiate rules with confidence that suggested secure attachment and healthy boundary setting that Carrie had worked hard to model. They spent the next 2 hours at the playground. Howard following Tiger's lead through various games and activities, while Carrie watched from a bench close enough to intervene if needed. Howard was awkward at first, clearly inexperienced with 3-year-olds, but he learned quickly and showed patience when Tiger changed his mind 6 times about what game they were playing. He pushed Tiger on the swings without being asked, helped him across the monkey bars with gentle encouragement, sat in the sandpit and built castles that Tiger immediately destroyed while laughing maniacally. Carrie watched Howard watch Tiger, saw the love and grief warring on his face when Tiger wasn't looking, and felt her anger soften despite her determination to maintain it. Howard was trying, genuinely putting in effort, showing up in ways that mattered more than money or gifts. He was letting Tiger control their interaction, wasn't forcing affection or demanding recognition, just being present and engaged with no agenda beyond connecting with his son. It was more than Carrie expected, and different from the Howard she remembered, who'd been so controlled by his mother's expectations that he couldn't see clearly past them. When their 2 hours were ending, Tiger surprised everyone by hugging Howard's leg and saying, "This was fun, can you come play again?" The casual request devastated Howard in visible ways, and Carrie saw him struggle to compose himself before responding. "I would love to come play again. Your mama will decide when that can happen, and I'll show up whenever she says I can, okay?" Tiger nodded, already distracted by another child's interesting toy, and Howard stood to face Carrie with an expression asking for permission he knew he couldn't demand. Carrie felt something shift in her resolve, a recognition that Tiger deserved this relationship if Howard could sustain it, that her anger shouldn't prevent her son from knowing his father. "Same time in 2 weeks. Carrie said, her voice carefully neutral. "Same rules apply. You're consistent for 3 months. We'll talk about expanding visitation. You disappoint him even once, we're done." "I'll be here," Howard promised. "Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it." "You're right, you don't. But Tiger deserves a father. And if you can be that person, then I won't stand in the way. Don't make me regret this, Howard." He nodded and walked away, glancing back multiple times at Tiger until distance made it impossible, and Carrie felt the weight of the decision settle over her. She'd opened the door she'd kept locked for 3 years, and now she'd have to live with whatever consequences that brought, both the good and the complicated, the healing and the hurt that would inevitably tangle together as they navigated this new reality. The next visitation happened exactly 2 weeks later, and Howard was early, waiting at the park when they arrived, and Tiger ran to him with recognition and excitement that made Carrie's chest tight with complicated emotions. They established a routine over the following months, twice monthly visits that gradually extended from 2 hours to 4 to full days as Tiger's comfort grew, and Howard proved himself reliable. He never missed a visit, never showed up late, always followed Carrie's rules exactly, and slowly Carrie began to trust that maybe he really had changed, that losing them had taught him something about priorities and weakness, that his mother's death had freed him to actually learn. But trust was still fragile, built in careful layers that one mistake could shatter, and Carrie maintained her boundaries with vigilance that sometimes felt exhausting, but always felt necessary. Howard was Tiger's father now in ways that mattered, showing up consistently and building connection through accumulated small moments. But he wasn't Carrie's partner, and she wasn't sure he ever could be again, wasn't sure the damage from 3 years ago could ever be repaired enough to risk her heart on him a second time. 6 months after that first visitation, Howard asked through Rebecca if he could start having overnights with Tiger, and Carrie agreed with conditions that felt reasonable to her and probably draconian to him. 1 night a month for 3 months, then reassess. Tiger would have his own room at Howard's apartment with familiar items from home. Howard would follow Tiger's routines exactly, including bedtimes and food preferences and screen time limits. Any deviation from agreed parameters would end overnights immediately. Howard agreed without argument, and the first overnight visit happened on a Friday that Carrie spent anxiously checking her phone every 30 minutes, despite knowing she needed to let go and trust the process. Tiger came home the next morning full of stories about pancakes for breakfast and a movie marathon, and how Howard let him build a blanket fort that stayed up all night. He was happy and safe and completely unharmed by the overnight. And Carrie forced herself to acknowledge that Howard was doing everything right, was being the father Tiger deserved, even if it was 3 years too late. But Carrie still kept her distance emotionally, still treated Howard like a co-worker in the shared project of raising Tiger rather than as someone she had personal connection to, and Howard seemed to understand that was all he'd get for now, maybe all he'd get ever, and he accepted those limitations without pushing for more. 3 years of silence had been broken, and they were navigating this new reality one careful step at a time, building something functional if not healed, something sustainable if not whole. And maybe that was the best any of them could hope for, given where they'd started and how far they'd fallen before clawing their way back to this fragile, uncertain peace. Chapter 7. The Grandmother's Shadow. Tiger's 4th birthday came with an invitation that felt like a trap, Howard asking if they could celebrate together at his apartment, and Carrie's first instinct was to refuse because crossing into Howard's personal space felt too intimate, too much like accepting him back into their lives in ways beyond co-parenting. But Tiger heard about the invitation and got excited about seeing where his dad lived, about having 2 birthday celebrations instead of 1, and Carrie couldn't deny him that joy without explaining complications a 4-year-old couldn't understand. So she agreed with the same careful conditions she applied to everything involving Howard. They'd come for 2 hours in the afternoon, Carrie would stay the entire time, and if anything made her uncomfortable, they'd leave immediately. Howard's apartment surprised her by being modest. Nothing like the penthouse she remembered, but instead a family-friendly space with Tiger's room decorated in colorful dinosaurs and shelves full of age-appropriate books. The kitchen had a kid's step stool and plastic dishes. The living room had bins of toys organized by type, everything designed around accommodating a 4-year-old rather than impressing visitors with wealth. Howard had clearly put thought into making Tiger comfortable, and despite herself, Carrie felt that softening again, that grudging acknowledgement that he was trying in ways that mattered. The party was simple and perfect. Homemade cake that Howard admitted he'd burned 3 times before getting right. Decorations Tiger had helped choose over video chat, games and activities at exactly Tiger's level of engagement. They sang Happy Birthday, and Tiger blew out his candles with fierce concentration, making a wish he refused to tell anyone, because wishes don't come true if you share them. Carrie watched Howard watch their son, and saw something she'd been carefully ignoring for months, that Howard loved Tiger completely and genuinely, that this wasn't obligation or guilt, but real paternal devotion that had grown through accumulated small moments. After Tiger fell asleep on the couch, exhausted from excitement and cake, Howard asked Carrie if they could talk, really talk, and her first instinct was to refuse, but something in his expression made her agree. They sat at the kitchen table while Tiger slept in the next room, and Howard pulled out a box filled with papers and photographs that made Carrie's stomach clench with recognition. "These are all the files documenting what my mother did," Howard said quietly. "The falsified paternity test, the fabricated photos, the payments to everyone who helped her destroy us. I've been through them hundreds of times trying to understand how I missed it, how I let her manipulate me so completely, and I still don't have good answers beyond admitting I was weak and controlled and chose her approval over your truth." Carrie looked through the papers, seeing Dolores's handwriting outlining the plan, seeing proof of what she'd always known, but never been able to prove. The vindication felt hollow because it came 3 years too late to matter, but it was something, confirmation that she hadn't been crazy or paranoid, that her instincts about Dolores's manipulation had been accurate even when Howard couldn't see it. "Why are you showing me this now?" Carrie asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Because you deserve to see it, deserve to know that you were right about everything. My mother was a monster, and I was too weak to see it until she was dead and couldn't manipulate me anymore. And because I need you to understand that I know what I did, I know the choice I made and how wrong it was, and I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I am asking that you believe my regret is genuine." Carrie studied Howard across the table, This man she'd loved and hated, and gradually felt nothing about except complicated obligation tied to their son. She saw the weight he carried in his posture, the genuine remorse in his eyes, the way 3 years had aged him in ways that suggested suffering she hadn't witnessed. Part of her wanted to hurt him more, to make him feel a fraction of what she'd felt when he threw her out. But that impulse felt petty and exhausting, keeping them both trapped in the past instead of building toward whatever future might be possible. "I believe you're sorry," Carrie said finally. "I believe you regret what happened, and I believe you love Tiger, but that doesn't fix what you broke, Howard. Sorry doesn't give me back the 3 years I struggled alone, doesn't erase the trauma of nearly dying in childbirth without you there, doesn't make me trust you won't fall apart again if life gets hard. You're Tiger's father now, and you're doing that job well, but that's all you are. We're not friends, we're not partners, we're just two people raising a kid together, and I don't know if we'll ever be more than that." Howard nodded, acceptance written across his face, even though she could see the hope dying in his eyes. "I understand. I'll take whatever relationship you're willing to give me with Tiger, and I won't push for more with you. But I want you to know that I've spent 3 years wishing I could go back and make different choices, and if I could trade everything I have for a chance to do it over, I would. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I destroyed us because I was too weak to choose you over my mother's poison." The confession should have meant something, but Carrie felt only weariness, exhaustion from carrying this complicated history and trying to build a functional future from its rubble. "I need to get Tiger home. Thank you for the party. He had a really good time. Same schedule next week for your regular visit?" Howard looked like he wanted to say more, but stopped himself. Just nodded and helped Carrie carry sleeping Tiger to her car, stood in the parking lot watching them drive away like he always did, holding on to every last moment before distance separated them again. Carrie glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him still standing there, and felt something twist in her chest that might have been sympathy, or might have been the ghost of old feelings she thought she'd buried completely. The next morning, Tiger asked a question that Carrie had been dreading, the inevitable curiosity that comes when a child starts processing family relationships. "Why doesn't Dad live with us like Jacob's dad lives with his family? Did you have a fight?" Carrie pulled Tiger onto her lap and tried to find words that were honest but age-appropriate, that didn't make Howard the villain but didn't erase the hurt either. "Grown-ups sometimes make mistakes that hurt each other, and when that happens, sometimes it's better to live separately, even though we both love you very much. Your dad and I had some big problems before you were born, and we're still figuring out how to be friends again. But that has nothing to do with you, sweetheart. We both love you more than anything." "Is it my fault you had problems?" Tiger asked, and the question broke Carrie's heart because she should have anticipated this, should have known a perceptive 4-year-old would internalize adult conflicts. "Absolutely not," Carrie said firmly, holding Tiger close. "Nothing about any of this is your fault. You are the best thing that ever happened to both of us, and the problems your dad and I had were about grown-up stuff that had nothing to do with you. You understand?" Tiger nodded against her chest, and Carrie held him until he squirmed away to play, leaving her sitting alone, wondering if they were doing right by him, if this fractured family was good enough, or if Tiger deserved better than parents who could coexist but couldn't repair what was broken between them. That night, Carrie couldn't sleep, kept thinking about the files Howard had shown her, the proof of Dolores's manipulation, the validation that Carrie's instincts had been right all along. She found herself wondering what would have happened if Howard had believed her from the beginning, if he'd had the strength to question his mother instead of choosing the easy path of believing fabricated evidence. Would they still be together? Would Tiger have grown up in an intact family? Would Carrie have avoided the trauma that still sometimes manifested in panic attacks when stress got too high? The wondering felt pointless because the past was fixed and unchangeable, but Carrie couldn't stop her mind from circling these questions, from imagining the parallel life they could have had if Howard had been braver, if Dolores had been less cruel, if Carrie had somehow managed to prove the truth before everything collapsed. She fell asleep finally thinking about Dolores, about the woman who died without ever facing consequences for destroying her son's family, and wondered if Dolores had ever regretted her choices, or if she died satisfied that she'd eliminated the unsuitable woman from Howard's life, even temporarily. The next time Howard picked up Tiger for his regular visit, Carrie handed him a box containing copies of all the files he'd shown her, telling him she'd made duplicates before giving back the originals. Howard looked confused until Carrie explained her reasoning. Tiger is going to ask questions someday about why we're not together, about what happened before he was born. When he's old enough to understand, he deserves to see these, deserves to know the truth about what your mother did and the choices you made. He deserves to form his own opinion about all of us based on facts, not whatever sanitized version we give him to make ourselves look better. Howard's face went pale. You want him to know what I did? How badly I failed you? I want him to know the truth, Carrie said firmly. All of it, including that your mother was manipulative and you were controlled, and I nearly died giving birth alone. He'll judge us both based on what we did, not what we wish we'd done. And maybe that will make him understand why we can't just fix this and be a normal family. Why some damage is too big to repair completely, even when everyone is trying their best. Howard took the box with shaking hands, and Carrie saw understanding settle over him that his son would someday know exactly how weak he'd been, how completely he'd failed the woman carrying his child. The accountability felt important, even though it was years away. A promise that truth would matter more than comfort when Tiger was old enough to handle complexity. 3 years had passed since Dolores destroyed them, and her shadow still stretched across their lives in ways both visible and subtle, shaping their relationship through absence as much as her presence had shaped Howard's choices when she was alive. Chapter 8. Breakthrough. The call came on a Tuesday night when Carrie was working her shift at the hospital, Janet watching Tiger at Carrie's apartment like she did twice a week when childcare schedules didn't align with work schedules. Howard's name lit up her phone screen, and Carrie's first instinct was to ignore it because they only spoke about Tiger-related logistics, and it was past Tiger's bedtime, so nothing should require urgent communication. But something made her answer. Some instinct that recognized emergency in the timing, and Howard's voice confirmed her fear immediately. Carrie, I'm so sorry to call, but I didn't know who else to reach out to. I'm having a panic attack and I can't get it under control, and I know this isn't your problem, but I'm alone and I'm scared and I just needed to hear someone's voice who understands what I lost. The vulnerability in his admission shocked Carrie into action, and she found herself talking him through breathing exercises she'd learned in nursing school, her professional training, overriding personal resentment. She stayed on the phone with Howard for 40 minutes, talking him down from the spiral, listening to him confess fears and regrets she didn't ask for but couldn't hang up on. He told her about therapy and nightmares and how sometimes he couldn't breathe when he thought about Tiger growing up without him those first 3 years. He told her the guilt was physically crushing him, that some days he couldn't get out of bed because facing another day of being the man who'd thrown away his family felt impossible. Carrie felt her professional distance cracking under the weight of Howard's pain, and she found herself offering comfort she'd sworn she'd never give. You can't change the past, Howard. You can only show up differently now, be better going forward, prove through sustained action that you've learned. Tiger loves you, sees you as his dad now, and that matters more than the time you missed. He won't remember those first 3 years, won't hold them against you the way I do. You get a fresh start with him, even if you don't get one with me. I don't deserve a fresh start with anyone, Howard said, his voice thick with emotion. I destroyed the only real thing I ever had because I was too weak to stand up to a dead woman's expectations. Some mistakes are too big to recover from. Maybe, Carrie agreed, because lying felt cruel when truth was what Howard needed. But you're recovering anyway, building a relationship with Tiger that matters regardless of what you missed. That has to count for something. They talked until Howard's breathing steadied and the panic released its grip. And when they finally hung up, Carrie sat in the hospital break room wondering what had just happened, how she'd gone from maintaining careful distance to providing emotional support, whether that was a mistake that would complicate everything or a necessary step toward some kind of healing. She'd seen Howard's genuine breakdown, his unfiltered suffering, and she couldn't unsee it, couldn't pretend he wasn't drowning in guilt that maybe he'd earned. But that was destroying him anyway. The next time Howard picked up Tiger, Carrie asked if he was okay, and Howard looked surprised that she'd follow up before admitting he was embarrassed about the phone call, about dumping his breakdown on her when she owed him nothing. "I shouldn't have called you," Howard said. "You're not responsible for managing my guilt or helping me through panic attacks about my own failures. I'm sorry for putting that on you." "I'm a nurse," Carrie said, which wasn't really an answer, but was the only explanation she could offer. "When someone is in crisis, I help. That's who I am regardless of history. But you should probably have a therapist you can call for those moments instead of me, because I can't be your emotional support while we're trying to co-parent. That's not fair to either of us." Howard nodded, accepting the boundary she was setting even though she could see disappointment flash across his face. They were both trying to navigate this complicated relationship where they shared a child but couldn't quite be friends, where history pulled them toward either intimacy or distance, but never let them settle comfortably in between. The phone call had shifted something between them, though, made Howard more real and less abstract, transformed him from the man who'd hurt her into a whole person who was suffering consequences of his own choices. Over the following weeks, Carrie found herself thinking about Howard more than she wanted to, wondering if he was okay, whether his therapy was helping, if he had other support besides Tiger's visits to keep him connected to life beyond guilt. She told herself it was just concern born from seeing someone in crisis, that any decent human would care about another person's well-being, but she suspected the truth was more complicated than professional compassion. Tiger adored his father now, talked about him constantly, showed off pictures Howard had given him of them together, counted days until the next visit with visible excitement that made Carrie's complicated feelings even harder to navigate. Her son deserved this relationship with his father, deserved the stability of knowing both parents loved him even if those parents couldn't love each other. But watching Tiger bond with Howard made Carrie wonder what she was protecting by maintaining distance, whether her anger was justified caution or just pride, keeping her from acknowledging that maybe Howard had changed, that maybe people could grow from their worst mistakes if given enough time and motivation. One Saturday, when Howard brought Tiger home from a visit, Tiger ran inside to show his friends a new toy, leaving Carrie and Howard alone on the doorstep longer than their usual handoff required. Howard looked like he wanted to say something, kept starting and stopping, until Carrie finally asked what was on his mind. "I've been going to therapy twice a week for almost a year now," Howard said, the words tumbling out like they'd been practiced. "Working through childhood trauma and mother issues and all the ways Dolores controlled me, learning to set boundaries and trust my own judgment. My therapist suggested I invite you to a session, not as couples therapy, but just so I can apologize properly with a mediator present, say everything I need to say without putting it all on you to manage my emotions. I know you probably don't want to. I know sitting in a room while I talk about my failures sounds terrible, but I wanted to offer anyway." Carrie's first instinct was to refuse because she'd heard Howard's apologies before, and more words wouldn't change the fundamental fact that he'd thrown her out pregnant and missed 3 years of their son's life. But something in his face stopped her automatic rejection, something genuine and hopeful that suggested this meant more to him than just checking a box on his redemption checklist. "Let me think about it," Carrie said finally. "I'm not promising anything, but I'll consider whether that might be helpful. Can you have your therapist send me information about what the session would involve so I can make an informed decision?" Hope flared in Howard's eyes, bright and desperate. "Yes, absolutely. I'll have her reach out this week. Thank you for even considering it, Carrie. I know you don't owe me anything." They stood in awkward silence for another moment before Tiger came barreling back outside, demanding Howard come see his room, and the moment broke into domestic chaos that left no space for heavy conversations. But Carrie found herself thinking about the therapy invitation for days afterward, weighing whether sitting through Howard's mediated apology would provide any closure or just reopen wounds she'd worked hard to heal. She called Sandra for advice, and Sandra asked the question Carrie had been avoiding. What do you want from this? Do you want closure so you can move on completely, or are you hoping for something else, something that might lead back toward him? I don't know, Carrie admitted. I'm not in love with him anymore, I know that, but I also don't hate him the way I used to, and that confuses me. Maybe hearing his apology in a structured setting would help me figure out whether we can ever be actual friends, or whether we're always going to be two people who share a kid but can't quite stand each other. Then go, Sandra said simply. Go and listen and see what happens. Worst case scenario, you get some closure and confirmation that distance is right. Best case scenario, you find a way forward that's healthier for everyone, including Tiger. But go with an open mind, not expecting anything specific, and see what the experience teaches you. Carrie agreed to the therapy session, and 2 weeks later found herself sitting in a comfortable office across from Howard with a therapist named Dr. Patricia Okafor mediating their conversation. Patricia explained the ground rules, that this wasn't couples therapy, but a structured dialogue where Howard would share his perspective and process while Carrie listened, and then Carrie would have space to respond or not respond as she chose, and Patricia would help facilitate if emotions got too intense. Howard took a shaking breath and began talking, telling his story from the beginning, his childhood with Dolores and the control she'd exerted over every aspect of his life, the ways he'd learned to please her at the expense of his own judgment and happiness. He talked about meeting Carrie and feeling free for the first time, genuinely loved for himself rather than his money or potential. He talked about the pregnancy and his initial joy that got poisoned by his mother's disapproval, the growing doubt she'd planted about Carrie's motivations. And then he talked about the fake paternity test and how easily he'd believed it, because believing Dolores was easier than standing up to her, because his conditioning ran so deep that questioning his mother felt impossible even when evidence contradicted everything he knew about the woman he loved. He talked about throwing Carrie out and the immediate regret that he'd buried under alcohol and his mother's reinforcement that he'd done the right thing. He talked about discovering the truth after Dolores died and the guilt that had become his constant companion. The way he woke up every morning thinking about the 3 years he'd missed and the woman he'd destroyed. He talked about finding Carrie and meeting Tiger and understanding that sorry would never be enough, that some damage couldn't be fixed, but he had to try anyway because giving up meant accepting he was as weak as his worst moment suggested. Carrie listened without interrupting, letting Howard's words wash over her, and she saw him clearly maybe for the first time since everything fell apart. He wasn't the man she'd loved, who'd seemed strong and independent. That person had been partially her projection of who she'd wanted him to be. But he also wasn't the monster she'd convinced herself he was during the worst of her anger, the villain who'd callously abandoned her without conscience or regret. He was just a damaged person who'd made terrible choices under his mother's influence, who was trying desperately to be better while carrying guilt that might never fully release its grip. When Howard finished, Patricia asked Carrie if she wanted to respond, and Carrie found herself speaking truths she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "I can't forgive you," Carrie said, her voice steady. "I can't say it's okay that you threw me out pregnant, or that I understand why you believed a fake test over 3 years of loyalty. I can't erase the trauma of nearly dying alone, or the struggle of raising Tiger those first years with no support. I can't fix your guilt or make you feel better about your choices, because you made them and you have to live with them." Howard nodded, tears streaming down his face, and Carrie continued. "But I also can't keep punishing you forever, can't let what happened poison the relationship Tiger needs us to have. You're a good father to him now, showing up consistently and loving him genuinely. and that matters more than the time you missed. So I can't forgive you, but I can accept that you're different now, that you've grown past whoever you were when Dolores controlled you, and maybe that's enough for us to build some kind of friendship, not what we had before, but something functional and honest." "That's more than I hoped for," Howard said quietly. "Thank you for even considering friendship after everything I did. I'll take whatever relationship you're willing to offer and be grateful for it." The session ended with no dramatic revelations or sudden healing, just two damaged people agreeing to try being decent to each other for their son's sake, and maybe eventually for their own. Carrie left feeling lighter than she had in months, unburdened by some weight she'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had become. She didn't love Howard, and probably never would again, but she didn't hate him either, and that neutral space felt like progress after years of complicated resentment. Things shifted gradually after that session, conversations becoming easier, handoffs including actual friendly chat instead of just logistics, both of them relaxing into a co-parenting relationship that felt sustainable and even occasionally pleasant. They weren't friends exactly, but they weren't enemies either, and Tiger benefited from the decreased tension in ways both visible and subtle. He stopped asking why his parents didn't live together, seemed to accept that this was just how their family worked, and that acceptance freed all of them to focus on building the present instead of mourning what the past destroyed. 3 years after everything fell apart, they were finally finding a way forward that served everyone, messy and imperfect but functional, and sometimes functional was enough. Chapter 9. The Unexpected. The phone call came from Howard's attorney Rebecca on a Wednesday afternoon, and her carefully neutral tone immediately put Carrie on alert. "Ms. Davis, I need to speak with you about a development regarding Howard Moore's late mother's estate. There's been a discovery that impacts you and Tiger directly, and we need to meet as soon as possible to discuss your legal options." Carrie's stomach dropped. What kind of discovery? Dolores has been dead for over a year. What could possibly come up now? Rebecca's pause was too calculated. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person with Howard present. Can you meet us tomorrow afternoon?" Carrie agreed to meet, arranged for Janet to watch Tiger, and spent the night wondering what fresh disaster Dolores had managed to create from beyond the grave. Howard looked as confused as Carrie felt when they met at Rebecca's office the next day, and Rebecca's expression was grim as she spread documents across the table. During the final review of Dolores Moore's financial records, we discovered a trust fund established 3 years ago, shortly before she orchestrated the fake paternity test. The trust was funded with $5 million and designated for Tiger Moore, to be released when he turns 18. Carrie stared at the papers. Dolores set up a trust fund for Tiger, the grandson she destroyed our family to prevent from existing. Rebecca's expression darkened. The trust documentation includes a letter to be opened when Tiger reaches majority. The letter details exactly what she did to break you and Howard apart, explains her reasoning, and concludes by saying she's securing Tiger's financial future as penance for causing him to grow up without his father. The room tilted beneath Carrie's feet. She knew the test was fake, and knew she was destroying us and did it anyway, then set up this trust fund like that somehow makes it okay. "It gets worse," Rebecca continued. "The trust includes conditions. Tiger only receives the money if he maintains no relationship with you beyond minimal contact required by law. If Tiger has a close relationship with you when he turns 18, the money goes to charity instead." Dolores structured this as one final manipulation, creating a financial incentive for Tiger to reject you. Howard made a sound like he'd been punched. "She set up a situation where Tiger has to choose between his mother and $5 million. How is that legal?" "It's legally enforceable, unfortunately," Rebecca said. "However, there are grounds to challenge it based on the fraudulent actions that preceded it and the emotional harm the conditions could cause Tiger. I believe we can get a court to dissolve the conditions, but it would require both of you testifying about what Dolores did, making public the fake paternity test and the manipulation. Carrie felt rage building in her chest. She's still trying to hurt me, still trying to separate me from my son, still manipulating us even when she's been dead for over a year. When does it end? Howard stood abruptly and walked to the window. When he spoke, his voice was raw. We fight it. We challenge every aspect of that trust. We make sure Tiger gets the money without conditions, and we make sure my mother's final manipulation fails. Dolores doesn't get to control our family anymore. Fighting this means making everything public, Rebecca warned. The fake paternity test, your mother's documentation, all of it becomes public record. Are you prepared for that? Yes, Howard said immediately. Tiger deserves to know the truth anyway, and he deserves that money without conditions that try to manipulate his relationships. We're fighting this. Carrie felt torn between protecting Tiger from publicity and ensuring he received his inheritance without poison attached. What if we just refuse the money entirely? Then Dolores wins again, Howard said quietly. She cost us 3 years, and now she'd cost Tiger $5 million. I won't let her keep taking things from us. We're fighting this, Carrie. Together. Something in Howard's determination touched the anger Carrie had been holding, and she found herself nodding. We fight it together. We tell the truth about what she did, and we make sure Tiger knows exactly why we made this choice when he's old enough to understand. The legal battle took 8 months, testimony and documentation that made Carrie feel exposed in ways she'd avoided for years. The media picked up the story, and suddenly Carrie and Tiger were public figures navigating cameras and reporters. Howard hired security and offered to let them stay at his place until things calmed down, and Carrie surprised herself by accepting because protecting Tiger mattered more than maintaining distance. Living in Howard's apartment for those months changed something between them, forced proximity that broke down remaining walls. They fell into domestic routines without planning it, cooking dinners together, talking about more than just Tiger's schedule. Carrie saw Howard's daily life, his therapy appointments and genuine efforts to be better. She saw him as a whole person instead of just the man who'd hurt her. Tiger loved having both parents in the same space, kept asking if this meant they were a family now. Carrie didn't know how to answer because she wasn't sure what they were becoming. The court ruled in their favor, dissolved the trust conditions, and granted Tiger unconditional access to the funds when he turned 18. Dolores's final manipulation had failed. When the ruling came down, Howard pulled Carrie into a hug without thinking, and Carrie let him, felt his relief and gratitude, and something else she wasn't ready to name. They stood there holding each other while Tiger played in the corner, and Rebecca diplomatically found paperwork to review in another room. Thank you for doing this with me, Howard said against her hair. Tiger is going to have the future he deserves because of you. Carrie pulled back to look at Howard's face. We did it together. That matters, Howard. We chose to fight together, and maybe that's the first genuinely healthy decision we've made as co-parents. Something shifted in Howard's expression. Does this mean we can try being more than co-parents, not jumping back into what we had before, but maybe building something new? Carrie's first instinct was to refuse, but she looked at Tiger and thought about the family they could build. I don't know. Maybe. Let's just keep living like this for now, see how it feels without putting pressure on it. Can that be enough for a while? That's more than enough, Howard said, and smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. They moved into uncertain territory after that, neither together nor separate, building something that felt like family without labels. And maybe that was the best they could hope for, this careful construction built on honesty instead of romance, functional and genuine even if it wasn't traditional. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. Tiger's 5th birthday party ended with both parents cleaning up together, and Howard finally asked the question he'd been holding for months, knowing the answer might destroy him. They sat on the balcony after everything was clean. Howard's hands trembled. I need to tell you something. I'm in love with you, Carrie. Not the way I loved you before when I was weak and easily controlled. This is different. I actually see you now. I see your strength, how you survived what I did to you. And I need to know if there's any possibility you might feel the same, or if I should accept we'll always just be co-parents." Carrie looked at him for a long moment, and Howard saw something in her expression that made his chest tight. Not love, but something more complicated. "I care about you, Howard. I catch myself looking for you when you're not around, but I don't know if what I feel is love or just relief that Tiger has a father, or maybe just exhaustion from being angry for so long." The honesty hurt more than outright rejection would have. "That's fair. That's more than fair." "And I'm terrified," Carrie continued. "Not just of you hurting me again, but of what it means that I'm even considering this. What does it say about me that I might take back the man who threw me out pregnant? Does that make me weak? Does that teach Tiger that you can destroy someone and still get everything you want if you just wait long enough?" Howard felt the words like physical blows because she was voicing fears he'd never fully acknowledged. "I don't know how to answer that. I don't know if trying again would be you being brave or me being selfish for asking. Maybe both." "Here's what I know," Carrie said, her voice steady. "I'm not the woman you fell in love with before. That Carrie died in a motel room when she almost bled out alone. The person I am now is harder, less trusting, and I don't know if she's capable of the kind of love we had before. And you're not the man I fell in love with either. You're someone trying to be better, but I don't know if better is enough." "Then what do we do?" Howard asked, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "We keep doing exactly this," Carrie said. "We live together. We raise Tiger together. We see if this is enough or if we'll always want something neither of us can give. But I'm not promising marriage or forever or happy ending, Howard. I'm promising to try, and some days that might be all I have." The conditional nature of it should have disappointed Howard, but instead he felt grateful. Trying is enough. More than I deserve. "Stop saying that," Carrie said sharply. "Stop talking about what you deserve or don't deserve. That's not how this works. I'm not giving you some gift you need to be grateful for. I'm making a choice that might be a mistake, and if it is, I'll make a different choice. This isn't about your redemption, Howard. It's about whether we can build something functional for Tiger." The words recalibrated something in Howard's understanding. She was right. He'd been treating her willingness to co-parent as generosity rather than her own choice made for her own reasons. "You're right. I'm sorry." Tiger found them the next morning and asked the inevitable question. "Are you together now? Like married?" Carrie knelt to his level. "We're a family, but not the kind you see on TV. We love each other in complicated ways. And we're trying to figure out what that means. Sometimes grown-ups don't have clear answers, and that's okay. Jacob's parents are divorced and they fight a lot," Tiger said with 5-year-old wisdom. "You don't fight, so I think you're doing better than them." The simple observation made both adults smile, and they pulled Tiger into a hug that felt like the truest promise they could make, not forever, but right now, and maybe that was all anyone really had. Months passed into a year. They had bad days when old resentment surfaced, when Carrie looked at Howard and saw the man who'd thrown her out, when Howard felt the weight of his choices crushing him. They had good days when they laughed together, when co-parenting felt natural, when the family they were building felt solid enough to last. Somewhere in that year, their relationship shifted from trying to survive each other to actively choosing each other, most days. Not every day. Some days Carrie still wanted to run, still felt trapped by the choice she'd made. Some days Howard wondered if he was being selfish by staying when leaving might be the kinder option. On Tiger's 6th birthday, Carrie made a decision. "I want us to sign a co-parenting agreement, legal, formal, spelling out custody and finances and expectations. Not because I don't trust you, but because I need to know we're committed to Tiger regardless of what happens between us." Howard felt the request like a door closing, but he understood. "You think we're not going to make it?" "I think we're human," Carrie corrected. I think love isn't enough, and romantic feelings come and go, and the only way to protect Tiger is to build a foundation that exists separate from whether we're together or not. Can you do that? Yes, Howard said, and meant it. They drew up papers that guaranteed Tiger would never be weapon or casualty in their relationship. That established both parents' rights, regardless of whether they stayed together or separated. They didn't marry. The absence of that milestone felt right for what they were. Two people building something functional from ruins, not recreating the fairy tale that had failed them before. Tiger grew up in a home with both parents, sometimes together and sometimes not, learning that families came in different shapes, and that was okay. When Tiger was old enough to read the files about Dolores, he understood both his parents better. Grandma was hurt, so she hurt you back. And Dad chose wrong because he was scared. And Mum survived something terrible, and now you're all just trying to be better than your worst moments. That's exactly right, Carrie said, pulling her son close. We're all just trying. The trust fund Dolores set up sat waiting for Tiger's 18th birthday. When he accessed it, he used a portion to fund a non-profit supporting women in crisis, naming it after his mother, who'd survived the worst and built a life from nothing. Howard pulled his son into a hug. I'm proud of you. And Carrie watched her husband, because they did eventually marry quietly when Tiger was 12, and asked why they didn't if they were already acting married, and felt something that wasn't the consuming love of before, but was steadier, more honest. They'd built something real from the ruins, not perfect but genuine, and maybe that was the better story after all. The end.